everyone, this is Speaker Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're just going to give some quick thoughts on the first trailer of Christopher Nolan's upcoming historical epic, The Odyssey. Now the trailer itself, which dropped today earlier on Monday the 22nd of December 2025, was the first real look at Nolan's interpretation of the famous piece of Greek literature by Homer, his other renowned piece being the Battle of Troy, of course involving the famous battles between the Trojans and the Greeks, featuring the infamous encounter between Achilles and Hector, and the wooden horse, and the romance between Paris and Helen of Troy, of course. Now, the Odyssey tells the story 10 years later after the Battle of Troy, following Greek soldier Odysseus and his 10-year journey back to his home at Attica, where he encounters many obstacles and dangers, including mythical creatures and other temptations. And as he returns home to his family, he uncovers further secrets and faces a struggle to reclaim back his palace. Now, the Christopher Nolan project is his latest, of course, following his major Oscar-winning triumph Oppenheimer from 2023, and has a whole multitude of A-list actors from Matt Damon to Tom Holland and Hathaway, Robert Pattinson, Peter Ngo, and Zendaya, and also Charlize Theron. The mega project has a massive $250 million budget, the biggest of Nolan's career, and is due for release on July the 17th, 2026, amongst one of the most highly anticipated releases of that year. So when looking at the trailer itself, I'd say overall, I was much more curious, if not slightly underwhelmed, for such a big release like this. If anything, this did feel much more closer to an actual teaser, not really revealing too much, and I suppose that's what a first full trailer should do to an extent. Now, being a typical Nolan project, this trailer shows the typical signs of a serious, super epic piece of entertainment. We get plenty of those wide-spanning shots and landscapes and natural locations. The movie itself was shot all over from Scotland, Greece and Italy. And we get the usual booming, wailing, synthesized musical soundtrack from Ludwig Göransson, who it seems at this stage is almost like a Hans Zimmer replacement or adjacent, certainly when you look at his last couple of films. And he is reuniting once more with Nolan for the third time, I believe, after previously with Oppenheimer and both Tenet. We look at Matt Damon, who is a surprising lead choice, given his later stages of his career. You'd think this would certainly merit much more of a physically active and imposing actor, let's say for the likes of, say, Chris Hemsworth or Henry Cavill. But it looks like Matt Damon has got in enough shape here, as we see him in the earlier scenes leading his army at the various stages back home. We see him later on the ship when they're rowing and they're coming under various struggles, and we see him later on leading his armies through various caves and forests. And we get scenes here where we see him looking at the various fallen soldiers and their broken armor. We also get an earlier shot of Tom Holland, who will be playing Odysseus' son, named Telemachus, searching for his father, and this will likely be in the later stages of the story. We also see Anne Hathaway as Odysseus' wife Penelope, who will be trying to warn off the various suitors who are trying to take over Odysseus' palace. So visually, it looks absolutely fine, if not a little bit nurtured, I would say, in terms of the overall contrast and colour scheme, and maybe a bit limited in terms of its scope. But again, this is the first look, and I would expect much more when we get to the second trailer. Now, for me personally, I'm a massive fan of the whole historical epic, sword and fantasy and sorcery genre. I will always be interested in any big budget entry in this field. And of course, in the early to mid 2000s, we saw a resurgence fueled by the likes of The Gladiator, and then later on with the likes of Kingdom of Heaven and Last Samurai also. But the real fascination here is Nolan himself, and that The Odyssey represents a first real change of pace and genre. When we look at his work, it consists mostly of the modern day contemporary setting, fueled with elements of science fiction and time travel and reality and existential concepts and themes. Okay, we get the odd exception with the likes of Dunkirk and, let's say, Insomnia, but for the most part there is a consistency here in terms of technical sophistication, going back and forth in a non-linear type of storytelling, a super serious, grounded, realistic vision. But the Odyssey, as I mentioned, is a historical epic, and when you read the outset of the story, you do have a lot more of potential fantasy elements in terms of the reference of the Greek gods, all of the monsters and the beasts that Odysseus encounters. And that's the real crux of the story, as we focused on the various threats that Odysseus faces on his journey home. So how exactly will Nolan take on these type of themes? As mentioned before, he's a very serious director who is very adverse to fantasy and special effects and overloading of CGI. Yes, we had those elements to an extent in both Tenet and Inception. But once more, those are in terms of exploring very serious science fiction type of concepts. We throw in the same entry with Interstellar also. We saw this serious approach most apparent with his Dark Knight trilogy, and his intended realistic take on Batman that ignored the more comic book elements in terms of how Gotham City looked, where it was very much more like New York or Detroit. And he purposely toned down the supervillainry, which was admired at first but has been criticised most recently, with many villains not really having the same comic book aura that we got from their source material. Ideally, when we saw Zack Snyder's Man of Steel back in 2013, if things had played out normally, we would have easily seen a Superman and Batman movie featuring Henry Cavill's Superman and Christian Bale's Batman, but it was Nolan's insistence not to be linked in any way, shape or form with the more superpowered beings of the DC universe. And when we look at this trailer, it does definitely look like he's going again for that more grounded approach. We're certainly not going to get the huge assortment of giant beasts and monoliths that what we saw from, say, the likes of the Clash of the Titans movies. When we look at the trailer, it seems that any monsters or beasts that Odysseus encounters are going to be hidden very much in shadow or darkened filters. Now, of course, there'll be many fans and critics that will praise this type of approach, but will it work against Nolan if the source material comes across as certainly underused or underutilized because of his serious approach? I'm not saying in any way, shape or form that the Odyssey has to be some sort of comedy fantasy, but we can't deny that when we look at Nolan's work, there does remain a certain lack of, if not characterization, then a certain amount of charm or charisma and personality with a lot of the characters that he portrays throughout his movies. And in theory, we could say that the Odyssey should be a real thrill ride of spectacle, excitement and danger, certainly within the first half when Odysseus is on his journey back home, and then perhaps we should get much more intrigue and secrecy as Odysseus then looks to see the signs of betrayal within his home. But with Nolan's style, will we see something that is too grounded, that is too nurtured? When we look at Matt Damon's appearance throughout the trailer, we see him later on looking more aged and rough. Will Nolan use much more of a psychological experience, trying to get into the thoughts and the psyche of Odysseus as he searches for his way back home? Will we see a much more deconstructed, broken down, tortured soul, again in keeping with Nolan's approach once more when we look at his Batman movies? Instead of focusing on the fantasy elements, will we see much more visions and nightmares in clever edited sequences like we certainly got within the later stages of Oppenheimer? And will Nolan once more use his technique of bouncing back and forth in a non-linear approach to try and keep the audience invested if there is a certain lack of spectacle? I certainly don't believe we will see anything like the same adventurism and intense fight sequences that what we saw with the movie of Troy back in 2004 starring Eric Bana and Brad Pitt. This is definitely going to be a different tone than what we saw with that particular movie. Now, people could bring up the argument, well, what does this matter? As Nolan, of course, has the box office record and the critical reception to back up his approach. He is very much indeed the one true current A-list director within the industry today. Anytime you mention his name, it generates a certain amount of excitement and hype. And as I said before, because of this, the Odyssey will remain one of the most highly anticipated movies within 2026. But at the same time, that is a very hefty $250 million budget. And as we see certainly now with today's commentary and coverage, any movie with that scale of budget is going to come under huge scrutiny when analysing its overall release and its box office weekend. So as I said at the start of the video, overall I'm curious but not overly excited so far with a first look at the Odyssey, but I expect a far more expansive second trailer, and at the very least it's good to see Nolan actually now branching out into a different type of genre, as I've always felt that this is something that he needs to do if he really wants to prove himself in terms of the true pantheon of the legendary directors with the likes of Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola. But we'll wait and see when the Odyssey releases next year and how it performs, as if it could further elevate the legacy of Christopher Nolan. So those are my thoughts and feelings when looking back at the first trailer of the Odyssey. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you have any other further movies, television series, or any other topics in the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd like to see me cover within the channel, then let me know in the comments, and I'll see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please also hit like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.